Well, good evening. Good evening. Welcome to my podcast, Real Talk with Lequita Taylor. I am so excited. We're growing. And, a lot of people are just complimenting and following. Again, I ask people to subscribe, share. I'm getting ready to start trying to have people come on and do commercials for them. I'm amazed at how people are starting to follow and wanting to be part of it. Again, as those that have not started to follow me, my podcast is very powerful. It's not about politics. It's not about drama and gang wars and everything. It's about real people, real talk, where people have had a true testimony. They've been through a lot and some of them did not ever think they would make it. But when you know God, and when God comes over and takes control of your life, what a difference your life will bring. So I thank God for my guest. We go way back. A lot of you all know him. He is a he is a true genuine people. He will speak it, try to tell it. I said, let's hit. Don't be telling too much now. This real talk now, but not too real. So for those that don't know him, my buddy is Keith Keeling. We all call him Petie. So I'm so excited that he's part of this evening. So how you doing?
Great. I'd like
Oh,
to first say thank you, Jesus, and thank you for having me here.
yes,
I
yes,
appreciate the opportunity to get something out in the air.
yes,
I-
yes, yes. Oh yeah, you really have been around. You've done a lot. And so I appreciate you. So tell a little bit about, I'm gonna let you kind of tell you a little bit about yourself, as far as family and the different thing. Then we'll go further today.
Well, born and raised in Denver.
Mm-hmm.
I was born at Denver General, not Denver Health. I don't know about no.
Uh-huh.
I was born in Denver General.
Okay.
We're here in Colorado, born and raised. But I say it once and I say it again. I tell everybody all the time. Denver is where I was born, but
Mm-hmm.
the United States is my home.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If that makes sense,
Uh-huh.
that's what it is.
You know that song, "Been Around the World and yeah.
From the apple to the pineapple, I done touched it.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
So you went to, let me get my glasses. We're gonna have a problem up in here today. Um, he is a father and grandfather, has a beautiful family. You can show tell a Keeling, I promise you.
This kid.
And so his mother and my mother, they grew up together. They were friends. And, we all had a history. That's one thing about coming here. When you really look at the full circle, all of us are connected in some kind of way. So, um, when we've talked about a lot now, his current life, we're going to get into that and do what we do. But he has been around. He's always been creative. I just have to say this real talk. We were just talking. I can't remember what year it was. I got to tell it.
Okay.
And Petey has always been one creative. He does
Very
creative
creative.
things. So
Very creative.
I had never. We laughed. I said, leave it to Petey. Back in the day, it was on Colfax and Beeler, I think. And you remember the movie Car Wash. Car Wash was those girls, they was out washing cars. They was all in their bikinis. So Petey, he got all, they had to be cute, honey. They had the long hair. They was built up. All they out there, they full of bubbles and they washing cars and people was wrecking cars. They couldn't believe what was going on Colfax and Beeler. But that's his creativity. I mean, he did it about 3 weeks. And then he said, the people said, what are you doing? I mean, I guess they was like, oh, don't be a focus running in the car looking at them women. But that's who he was. He always did something different. I will never forget that. That was so funny to me. So that's how he thinks. It's just like, as he said, he's been a hustler. We're going to talk about that because my thing with him is a hustler to an entrepreneur. And
Yeah.
so we all have a story. So I told him I want you to come and tell your story because when I look at him now and see where God is doing, he had his own family, own business, trucking, and we're gonna get into that. So if you could just tell a little bit, when you said you started hustling at 13, how did you start hustling at 13 and you still a baby?
Well, when you have a mom sit you down at the table and say,
Mm-hmm.
"Hey, you got to help me."
Okay.
When you come home and the lights are off, or ain't no food in the fridge,
Okay. Okay.
or
Makes
cold,
sense. Yeah.
you know, and she was tired. No,
Mhm.
she just said, "Look, you're the little man of the house. The rest of the children, they don't understand. You already been hustling. I'd already been kind of hustling, yeah,
Mhm. Mhm.
because I had a little job, but I still was doing my thing on the side,
Mhm.
and coming up with my new Converse back then, my fresh Levi's out of yellow front t-shirt.
Mhm.
She
Payless.
yeah,
Remember all that
yeah,
back when we
and
growing up?
she ain't buying none of it. She like, okay, well, if you're coming up with all this, then you need to help me,
Okay.
and I can
That's
still
like my mother with my brothers.
yeah. So as it turned out, I went from there, and then hey, it bloomed into something that I never really thought it would turn into,
Mhm.
but it did.
Mhm.
And that was out of pursuit of taking care of my mom and
Okay.
my brothers and sisters.
Okay.
That's where it started.
Okay. How many siblings did you have?
Three more than me.
Okay.
Two have gone on since.
I remember Billy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Man,
Mm.
when you look back over just growing up and things that you did, is there anything being young? We're not gonna talk about when you got older. Is there anything that you look back and say, man, I could have did different, even being young? Yeah, I'm young and I'm doing what I do, but
Mm.
is there something you can say, man, I wish I would have did a little different?
Well, in that particular headspace,
Mm-hmm.
you're really not thinking that way. You're
Okay.
really going off of what you see and what's being emulated around you, about money.
Mm-hmm.
So, you try and do the best you can
Mm-hmm.
what you got to work with.
Okay.
And that
Okay.
depends on which way it's going to be worked.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Determine
Okay.
which way you're going to go. And usually, you make some decisions that aren't the best decisions, because you're saying, okay, easy this, easy that. It's hard to tell a kid, like I say, 13, 14 years old, and I'm making $200-300 a day. You want me to go work at McDonald's and make $200-300 a week?
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to happen. So, in that retrospect, things could have been different,
Okay. Okay.
because you don't look at the long term goal with that $200 a week
Mm-hmm.
versus that $200 a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Man, that's oof. And I've had families, I had gangsters, everything. And I just, I used to look, and my brother's in and out the penitentiary, and my mother I ride with her up to Canyon City. And I used to say, Lord Jesus, and you get up there and then you go eat at a picnic table and mother crying
Okay.
and all that. I got to see all of that. And I was like, how are you doing this? But just keep living.
Yeah.
Our son Michael. Um, I never thought I would do it, and then when he was in trouble, I was the mama right there. He had a mother, but I helped raise him, and so
Mhm.
he was right there, and things that I said I wouldn't do, never say never,
That's right.
because you don't know how life will have you
That's
eat
right.
those words, and I was right there.
That's
I
right.
called him Pooh. It's too many Michaels. Michael DeShawn, Michael Taylor Sr., Michael Jr. Oh, Lord.
I often wonder how you
I
manage. I
don't
like,
know. Tell my aunt
yeah,
it was
yeah,
Michael, child, please.
yeah.
So, so after when you first got caught in one of your crimes, child, how did you how did you react? Like, Lord is home now. I mean, I know you were young, it wasn't couldn't have been that bad, but how did you act?
Oh no, it was bad.
Was it?
Yeah,
Okay.
it was bad.
How old were you when it came was bad?
18. I just turned 18. I was actually thinking about going to the military.
Okay.
I, checked into things and like, okay, I'm going to get out of here. And my mom was feeling kind of the same way. By then, I'm a seasoned vet in the streets,
Okay.
Yeah, I'm getting down
Yeah.
from our crown,
Yeah.
Ain't no way around it. I'm handling it, you know what I mean?
Uh,
I'm knocking it off, giving it to my mom, and making sure we good.
uh-huh.
But at the same token, me and I had some older partners
Okay.
that was cool with me, but I was the young one that was like
Mhm.
little
Mhm.
boss.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? And they was cool, you know what I mean? Don't get me wrong, but it was my hustle,
Mhm.
I involved them, and they were older, they were
Mhm.
down with me. You know what I mean? They didn't turn it back on me. And we ended up doing some stuff that was, robbery,
Okay.
and that was the
Okay.
first thing I thought that was real trouble. The real trouble comes later, but I thought that was real trouble, and it was. But
Mhm.
and that's when I had a real concern. Like, wait a minute, then you get in a system where you get a slap on the wrist
Mhm.
and you keep moving.
Okay.
So that really doesn't do any good,
Mhm.
you know. Um, and it doesn't really pan out to where it's in a deterrent is what I'm
Okay.
saying.
Okay.
So you go, okay, well, cool, I'm good with that. I got probation, keep it moving.
Mhm.
So then okay, well, I can go do something else. I'm just get
Mhm.
probation, you know.
Mhm.
But then, at that point, being at that point, you have your regular family
Mhm.
and you have your street family.
Okay.
And you have your street fathers, your street
Mhm.
mothers, street brothers, sisters, on down. You got a whole list of family
'Kay.
in the streets versus your regular family.
Man.
And the other street family, them was riders, them was some cold dudes
Yeah.
back then too.
Yeah, I know my
And
brother's friend.
so when I get knocked, hey man, that first go round, I called, one of my people was like, hey man, I got to get out of here with the group. Man, don't worry about it. You got the money when you get out? Yeah. All right. I'll pay you right out. Bam.
Mm.
Got out. Gave him his bread. You know what I'm saying? We cool. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Kept it moving. So you just kind of get in a repetitive way because you're really just kind of flipping, not really getting any
Mhm.
consequences
Mhm.
until it really comes down. You know what I mean?
Man. When did you find well, you always got haters and snakes and stuff like that. When did you start saying, "Man, really? I'm dealing with this and
Mm.
they about to roll tell on me and everything else." When was your first experience like you said, "No, this ain't right. He ain't right. She ain't right," or something? How old when were you when you was like, "Mm-mm, this ain't cool"?
As far as the snakes or as far as the life and someone telling.
The snakes telling on you where you be like, "Uh-uh." And then on the streets, you get common sense, and with different ones, and I mean, you was known. You was known, honey. My brothers, everybody knew you. I mean, they all y'all was
Mm.
have the different ones, honey. But when did you know, "No, I'm trusting these. This my family on the streets, but then they ain't doing me right. They waiting for me to get whatever, and then they gonna do me."
The main people in my circle, we all was solid.
Okay,
You know,
okay,
people didn't start falling apart until later in the game.
okay, okay,
And see, as long as it was the state and we kept them high powered lawyers in our corner,
okay.
they give you a number, you was good. You can move on. But then later on, the system got hip to that and they said, hold up. Let's send these big boys in now because they playing the system and they getting
Okay,
high.
okay.
So now we need to send these big boys in because there's a conflict of interest here with these guys with the state. So obviously,
Mhm.
that's not gonna work. So we had to send these feds in on these boys. And that's when the game changed.
Okay, okay. Now, we were talking earlier, and I know you said you did time in the federal
Mhm,
and the state,
mhm,
federal penitentiary and the state.
mhm.
Um, what did it catch you off guard, or you knew eventually it was coming?
Well, the feds did catch me off guard.
Okay,
The state I was cool with because I knew I was on probation.
okay.
I'm rolling, I'm doing my thing, that's just a formality of the game.
Mhm,
You're gonna either take a knock and keep it moving
mhm.
and keep doing your thing, with the state. That's
Okay.
how it is. But when the feds came, they caught me off guard because they just snatched me up out of nowhere.
Mhm,
And then I thought, okay, well, I'm thinking like the state, you go to court, you're gonna get a bond, you're gonna be good,
mhm,
you get back out and keep it moving.
mhm,
And no drugs, no case. You know what I mean?
mhm.
Boy, them people played a whole nother ball game. They played a whole nother ball game on me. Like, wait a minute. They
Man.
had the lady in the case that told on everybody from California to wherever, you know what I'm saying? She's from Denver
Okay.
and she told on 32 people.
Mm.
And they put us all in the same indictment and we don't even know each other, but the complexity of it was her, her being complacent and everybody getting caught up.
Mhm.
So they just lumped us into one big
Mm.
thing, and they took us to court, and
All of y'all at one time?
yeah, that
Ooh.
that court date, that date was for all of us.
'Kay.
And they brought so many people in from California, Las Vegas, all over. Yeah, and So we going to court. Now they picked me up. I ran from them a year earlier.
Mhm.
Okay, and they ran up on me about a year earlier, and I ran from them, and got away um, and then a year later, I actually got into a fight with the agent I was in barber school at the time down in
Man,
MSU,
uh-huh, uh-huh.
and he came down there tripping with me because the actual informant, when she got in the car trying to buy the drugs from me,
Exactly, exactly.
um, they actually drove by and they turned their back and they had tinted windows. When they turned their back, I could see the fluorescent eye
Oh.
on his jacket, when he went by. And I said, "Oh, wait a minute." And I looked at her and I said, "How much money you got?" And she said, "I only got this much." And I said, "That ain't what you normally do with me. You don't even have
Uh,
you don't even have the right amount of money." I said, "You telling." I said, "The people just," I said, "Let me out of here." She threw the money in my lap. I jumped out the car
man.
and ran, took off.
Uh-huh.
No drugs, ain't sold her nothing. She
Okay.
threw the money in my lap. I took off.
Mhm.
She drove off panicking, scared because she figured I knew I was gonna do something to her. So she drove off panicking, drove up 2 blocks, pulled over, and when she pulled over later on, because you get the tapes and all that,
Mhm, mhm.
oh man, it was a whole crew over there. So I run into my people's house. They searched the neighborhood looking for me, but they couldn't find me. So I come out the house once they finally supposedly left,
Mhm, mhm.
and my car was still sitting there, and me and 2 of my other people got in the car, and we left my people's house, and we peeled out, and when we turned the corner, it was just dusk. The sun was coming down and over the mountains or whatever.
Mhm.
It was just dusk. I turned the corner. When I turned the corner, I see all these headlights start lighting up, going, in single file, like a bunch of them. I'm like, "Dang, that's gotta be them," you know what
Were
I mean?
you just looking for you?
No, I was looking for me, yeah.
Okay.
But because I knew she had threw me that money, and
Okay.
I knew she was trying to set me up. I didn't know what was going on.
Okay,
I was trying
okay.
to make it to the crib at that
Okay,
point
okay.
so I can get to my mom and try and figure stuff out. So I turn the corner and I look up and all these lights are lighting up, and I said, "Dang, that's gotta be them." You know what I mean? Following me, and they running up on me in my
Oh.
bumper. And one thing, uh, one of my older street fathers
Mhm,
told me,
mhm.
said, "Man, if you feel like the people is following you, make a U-turn. Always make a U-turn." I went down about 3 or 4 blocks and I spent the U-turn on them. And when I come back and hit the dip,
Uh,
and he hit the dip,
yeah.
we both hit the dip like that,
Uh-huh.
and he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him through the tent. We both looking at each other through the tent, like you could tell we were looking at each other through the tent. And the cars was behind him. They stopping, about to run into each other, like, "What y'all gonna do? What's going on?" And I hit it. It was on. And I come sideways out the hole on them, and they don't know I had a Corvette motor in that Impala, and it was souped up. So I got when the front end come off the ground on and was gone, and they come trying to run into each other, trying to turn around.
Well, I know, and I know it's not funny, but even just hearing that
Yeah.
TV show, for real.
I got to the house on them. Well, I come down Colfax wide open. I turn on Colfax in Peoria, and I hit it. Now the weird thing is this: as I come down Colfax,
Mhm.
Aurora police, Denver police, they was blocking off the street.
Man.
I'm coming wide open and the feds is on my ass and I'm coming hard.
Ooh.
The front end's on the car and they blocking off the streets where nobody could, they knew I was coming. It was crazy. And when I got to Monaco and Colfax to make the right towards the crib, they just disappeared. Disappeared. I said, "Where'd they go?" I ran up in the yard and called my mom. I said, "Get in the backyard." I said, "I'm coming in hot. They on my ass."
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
And my mom, she a G. "Come on, where they at?"
I know, I know.
I said, "My,"
Heads wasn't no
I said, "Hold on, I'm pulling my jewelry off now. I'm snatching stuff off. I'm getting to my wallets and everything. I'm trying to pull up in the
Uh-huh,
backyard."
uh-huh.
And I pull up, and she's still on the phone in the
Mhm.
backyard. And I'm talking on my phone. I'm pulling up in the alley, and I pull up, jump out, and I hand her all my stuff. And I said, "They after me." She said, "Boy, ain't nobody after you." I said, "Yes, it is. It's a bunch of them." She said,
Were you afraid? I mean, were you
yeah,
like, I'm gonna die tonight?
no, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know who it was. But then a year later, they come back. I forgot all about it. I said, I got away. It's cool. Ain't no thing. She ain't tripping. I ain't tripping. I know her. She knows me. I know her whole family. They know mine. She knows she was wrong for this. And I said, well, she ain't tripping. I got the money. I ain't gonna worry about it. A year later, they came back, and I had the club by then, the Newport Lounge ran with my other street dad. You know what I'm saying? And they called me on the phone. I was like, Spanard called me on my phone. The gang unit sergeant guy, you know what I'm saying? He calls me on the phone and he's like, is this Petie? And I was like, yeah, who is this? He said, this is Spanard. I said, how the hell you get my damn number?
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Oh, well, we got ways and how we do it. No, we ain't got ways my ass. Why you on my damn phone? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Excuse me. I'm sorry.
Mhm.
But
But I did want real talk.
yeah,
But real talk is over with you. Okay,
okay.
go on.
So he tells me, we arrested some guys trying to break in your club last night.
Was that true?
Uh-uh.
Ooh.
I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, well, do you got him in jail? He said, yeah. I said, well, let him go. He didn't take nothing. I just left the club. I locked the door. I didn't see nothing. So I said, let him go. He said, no, I want you to look at the pictures and so you can see if you know him or not. And if we decide to foul, or even if we do let him go, at least you'll know who's been trying to break in your joint. I said, okay, well, you know where my mom stays because of my little brother. You know
Okay.
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I said, meet me there and bring the photo album with you. And I'll look at it and that's it. He's okay, no problem. So it was at 4 o'clock. I never forget.
In the morning,
In
at
the
night.
evening.
Okay, in the evening.
And I'm coming down the street behind the school over there, and I hit the stop sign. When I hit the stop sign, I'm in my Bronco, and I look, it's like 6 police cars parked on the curb at that stop sign. And when I pulled up, I seen the one in the passenger seat sit up and look at the other cop and kind of nudge him. I'm looking right at him. He nudged him.
Goodness.
And he looked at me like, that's him. And I looked at them like, oh boy, yep, and that's y'all. And I got on the phone. I hit my mom up again. I said, look, I remember I told you they was after me. She's like, what? I said, come back in the backyard. I'm telling you, they's right here. I'm looking right at them. I said, as soon as I hit it, they coming with me. She said, well, come on. I said, okay. I hit it, come down the alley. All 6 of them come with me. And we pull up in the backyard. And I jump out. I throw her all my jewelry, give her all the money I had, gave her everything, the keys to the car, everything. And they jump out. And they're like, you're under arrest. I said, for what? You know, thinking the state.
Exactly. Exactly.
He hits the window on my truck and said, the windows are too dark. I said, the windows are too dark. I said, where's Bernard? He's supposed to be meeting me here with a book about somebody breaking in my club. Oh, we don't know nothing about that. We just know you're under arrest for your windows. Turn around, put your hands behind your back. It's okay. Well, I'm not going to argue with you. Do what you're going to do. I'm going to get right out. I know y'all with me. You know what I mean? So he cuffs me up. Mom's standing right there. And next thing I know, he said, well, just wait right here for Spanard. That's okay. So mom's standing there. I'm standing there. All these cops are standing there in the backyard. And, excuse me. Next thing I know, I hear another car coming down the alley really fast. And I said, that must be Spanard. You know what I mean? He's coming to show me this book or what's going on. He can straighten this out with these people because ain't no sense of me being in handcuffs over no tinted windows.
Exactly.
This
Exactly.
is stupid. So I'm standing there and I look up and these brothers came around the corner. Goose Downs,
That means
Tim's,
what that mean?
Goose Down coats,
Okay. Okay.
Tim's, Levi's, New Jack City, baseball cap sideways with 4 of them. You know what I'm saying? And they was gold chains, everything, jeweled up, big jewelry like I had, everything. They walking up on me and I'm like, who is these people? What's going on? You know, so I'm tripping because I'm like, why are they walking up on us? And I'm looking at the cop like, what are you doing? How you let these people just walk up on us in my yard with my mom? You know what I mean? And that's when they walked up and they said, hey, Petie, how you doing?
No.
I said, "Who was you?" He said, "Oh, well, we've been on you for a little minute now." He said, "I'm Agent so and so, FBI, and this is my brother, Agent so and so, IRS, and this is so and so, Agent so and so, and this is so and so, Agent so and so," and was all brothers, big jury. I mean, you wouldn't even believe they was police. They was
Just like street folk do.
yeah, and he told the cop. He said, "Go and take the cuffs off of him." My mom's standing right there. He said, "Go and take the cuffs off." I'm still tripping like these are not, these are not police. You know what I'm saying? He said, "Well, you're right." He said, "We all work for the United States government, and they sent us here from Detroit just to get your, you know,
That's
yeah, you know what I'm saying." And I thought, this is crazy. My head is spinning because it's like I'm like, this is crazy. This is weird. Like these are not cops.
that is a trip.
So they told me, said, "We gonna take these cuffs off of you." You told the cop, "Take cuffs off." My mom's standing right there. He said, "I'm telling you right now, if you run, I'm kill you in front of your mama right here. If you run." I said, "What?" I said, "This dude is crazy." So they switched cuffs out, put cuffs on me and stuff. And they start walking me to the car. And I told Mom, call the lawyer, you know what I'm saying? And finna take me downtown to the regular place. You know what I mean? Cause I'm thinking this is some kind of vice unit, special unit or something. We cut the alley and get to the alley, and I see the car they was in, and they was in a Grand Am on gold Dayton's with gold metal flake in the car with beats in it. And I said, "I seen that car. I've seen that car right in the hood. Oh my God." I'm like, "What the?" I said, "Y'all was," I said, "Wow, this is crazy. Y'all was FBI in the hood the whole time in that car." I've been seeing that car everywhere on Car Boulevard, just rolling. I said, "Dang, I'm getting in this car." I couldn't believe. That's when I really flipped. Like, dang. They took me to the federal penitentiary in gold Dayton's in a Pontiac Le Mans with the gold flakes with beats. Pulled up to the prison and took me inside.
When they got you, they took you immediately to the federal.
Took me straight to the federal prison, to the detention center, straight. And when I got in there, come to find out, all these other people were in there too behind this same girl, same woman. Used to change my diaper when I was a kid. That's how well I knew her. Used to change my diaper. So I trusted her tremendously. And I loved her from that standpoint. She was really like an auntie, family, sister, you know what I'm saying? Period. And it really broke my heart when she did this stuff to me. You know what I mean? Because I would have never believed in if you couldn't have told me she would have did that to me.
Yep. Yeah.
So and
Well, let me ask you this. Why did she tell? Was she in trouble and wanted to try to get out herself, so you tell on
mhm.
other people? Oh,
She was in Cherry Creek doing nails,
okay.
and she was serving all the rich folks. I'ma just say the elite
Yeah.
out there because she was doing nails out there. She had a really good clientele, but she also had a very good clientele that liked
The street that loves drugs.
that liked to get high.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so they ended up telling on her. And then when they caught her, she had a gun and drugs and all this stuff on her. So then she automatically flipped. And the first thing she said, "Oh, I can get so and so for you." And
Okay. Like you see on
yeah,
TV.
and they was like, "Really?" And she's like, "Yeah, I can call him right now."
Oh man.
As I had been doing business with her, you know what I mean? And they was like, "Oh, if you can get him, it's on. Nope, you got a deal," you know. So she sold me down the river, and there was another high profile basketball coach
Mhm.
in Montbello that she told on too at the same time. So me and him knew each other personally from the street.
Mhm.
And when I walked into the cell house, he was in there. He seen me. He just fell on the ground, like, "Oh my God!" And I was like, he slid down the bench.
He knelt down like his
Oh,
own.
yeah. He said, "Oh." I said, "Oh, I felt so bad for him." You know what I mean? Like,
Cause he wasn't there. Some people act street and they do, but then it's like they're really not like, oh my God, I'm about to lose everything. I'm gonna cry like a baby.
he did. Big. Oh, he went there, and I felt so bad for him. I walked over to him. I had to hug him. Say, "Man, it's all right, man. We gonna be all right." I don't know if I was hugging him for me or for him, but something got to happen here. You know what I'm saying? You crying for both of us. So, man, look, it's gonna be all right. Oh, oh,
My goodness, you never know.
yeah,
So, with all of that, you served quite a bit of time, didn't
yeah. I did my little piece. They violated me on the probation in the state, and then that's when I figured out I was in the feds.
you? Okay.
And you know when you walk in there because the courtroom ain't the same. It's not the same setup
Okay.
as the state.
Uh-huh.
It's a whole nother building downtown. And you walk in that joint and it's like I walked in there and they got the eagle, that eagle on the dollars or whatever it was,
Yeah, yeah.
with the a
I
big
know.
chrome one over the bench in the back of the judge, and it's a huge eagle with the hooks and the thing.
Closet.
Yeah, and they got these beautiful, big, thick mahogany tables. It's just like they might be $50,000, $60,000 a piece, and it's beautiful little setup. And you walk in and you see that eagle, and you go, "Oh man, I'm in trouble."
Yeah, because they say the feds will follow you, and when they got all the proof they need, and it's guaranteed you busted and you gonna serve some time.
Yeah, they have a real good conviction rate. Okay,
Yeah.
so make a long story short about that, I they was telling me, okay, if you take this deal,
Mhm.
you get this amount of time, you're good.
Mhm.
I said, I didn't sell her nothing. She threw some money at me and I got out the car. Why y'all messing with me? You know what I mean? You want the money back? I mean, I'll give you money back. You know what I mean? That's all it is. That's all I got. They said, well, unfortunately, there's this law called contempt, intent.
What does that mean?
That means you intended to, you know, and you by yourself, if you make a deal for something with an informant
Mhm.
and you take the money or the money gets transferred to you some kind of way, she threw it in my lap,
Mhm.
and you take one step with that money, you just committed attempt. Now, whatever you negotiated with that person and you took the money for, even if you're lying, you can say, look, I'm finna go with you 100 pounds of crack right now. Give me the money. And they give you the money and you take off and they was trying to bust you and you get away, then when they catch you, they charge you with this just
Yeah.
yes, like you was gonna do the whole 100 pounds of crack. And you face time doing that. So they told me, well, you either take this deal for this amount of time for what you did, based on what y'all conversation was, or if you take it to trial and you lose, you're looking at life. So I said, well, dang, I tell you what, between my mom and my dad, they're both going to kill me if I help you do anything. Let's start there. That ain't going to happen. I said, so I don't have no choice. I'd rather go on and go to trial and get life and go on and you do what y'all do with me because I would never put somebody in the same predicament you got me in. You already got me. It's not going to do me no good to put somebody here with me. So do what you're going to do with me and let's get it on.
Mhm.
Went to court and I lost on a lesser charge,
Okay.
but I beat the life count.
Okay.
You can pull my name right now, Google it, and it'll come up with the federal case law that they use today to beat other federal cases with. Because when she got in the car, she solicited me for the amount of drugs
Okay.
that she wanted. Now, she and I normally talk about a certain kind of drug at that time and a certain amount of money. Remember, she didn't have the right money.
Mm.
So I'm looking at her like, what's going on? And then she implemented a different kind of drug than we normally would be talking about,
Oh.
which was the drug which should give you the more time. Okay. So because of that, I was facing life count. And because she solicited me for it, I beat it, or else I wouldn't be sitting here today. So I beat that case. And then did my time, did my state time, got all the stuff out the way. But the thing is, on the yard, I was out there with these cats, man. Some of the most magnificent brothers you ever want to see in your life. Solid, cool mother scooters. They was good brothers. You know what I'm saying? They was down. You know what I mean? And I mean, I'm out here shooting ball. We lifting weights. We hanging out. Good dudes, man. And we kicking it every day. You know what I mean? I'm like, man, check this out, man. When you brothers get out, we gonna hook up and link up and do some things. You know what I mean? For real. And uh, excuse me, who's getting out? It was like 5 or 6 of them. I said, "What you mean? Who's getting out? Ain't y'all getting out? You know, we can hook up." They're like, "No."
They got life.
I said, "What?" I said, "What you mean you ain't getting out?" "No, we got." I said, "You got life?" I said, "Yeah, all of us." I said, "You mean tell me I've been out here playing basketball and lifting weights with a bunch of lifers?" They like, "Yep, yep. We ain't none of us getting out. We ain't never getting out." I said, "Wow." And what threw me off about that was you get to know them brothers.
Yeah.
And we should sit and politic a whole lot
Yeah.
about things. So I learned their lifestyle, I learned the type of money they was getting, what they was doing on the streets, what do you know, jail talk.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, none of them was getting the kind
I didn't know about jail talk. I ain't never been to
well,
jail.
yeah,
Oh, okay.
none of them was getting the kind of money I was getting. None of 'em.
Yeah.
They could put them all in a pot together and they wouldn't get the money I was getting. And I thought to myself, these cats got life and they didn't even see no real money. And I beat this stuff, and this is some hellhole around here. I said, man, I'm gonna figure out this a whole different way when I get back. I ain't coming back in here. This is crazy. I'll be broke. Bump it. I don't need the money that bad. You know what I mean? And and I thought to myself, I said, well, you made plenty money with a gun and a scale, plenty money, but you made more money with a pen and a piece of paper,
Ain't that something?
and that was it. That's how it ended up being. You know what I mean? And I thought to myself, dang, if I'd have knew about this pen and paper from jump,
Yeah.
I'd have been all right.
Yeah.
Actually made some good money, you know, and you know, streets can't compare to the pen and paper money ever. The long term money that we speaking about, that $200 a week that you flip into something else legally that turns into something else that you can do something with that you didn't build a life with out of nothing, and it manifests something that's real
Mm.
financially, and it's good. So after that, I just thought, I ain't doing this no more. I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
Terrible, terrible. The whole thing was terrible, and a bunch of us was in there from Denver because they sent a whole unit here to Denver to lock up a whole bunch of brothers and sisters back then. It was a lot of us on the
Even though they really didn't say anything until later, how was their spirit? Were they like, as you people would say, perpetrating, like they're trying to hold on, or they're trying to hold on to whatever life of spirit that they have? Was it like, I don't, I know I'm not going anywhere else, but I mean, how is their spirit? Is it just broken or
It,
man?
it's a spirit of calm,
Hmm.
a spirit of giving up, a spirit of just like, okay, they got me. This is where I'm gonna be. And a spirit of acceptance is what I'm looking for.
Mm,
Acceptance.
mm, mm,
There's big acceptance there. And they all have that spirit, you know, like they broken with a spirit of acceptance. Like,
mm,
okay, I'm gonna be here. I ain't going nowhere else. There's nothing I can do. And as long as they got that on their mind, they're not doing hard time. You know, they've come to the realization that they're gonna be here. And then they start gelling like that. They start living like that.
mhm,
And then, you know, it makes it a lot easier for them. A lot of them had appeals already come and go.
mm,
They had been exhausted. You know, they're looking for other ways to come back and refile to try and go back to court
mhm,
and try and get time cut and all that. So Um, big shout out to Eric Holder, United States Attorney General.
Mhm.
He went in and changed a lot of that, where those cats got out of jail.
Mhm.
So today, most of those cats that were doing life in 30 and 60, I mean, just ridiculous numbers a time, they're on the street now because of that brother. Good. Yeah.
Mhm.
And cut them brothers loose. And now a lot of them are out here, and the majority of those cats that I'm speaking of
Mhm.
doing very well in life, very well, because it was a deterrent.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
It was a deterrent for the type of time that they had faced and the issues that they went through. Some of them lost families, some of them lost mothers, fathers, mothers and fathers, children. I mean, along the way, and couldn't go to the funerals, couldn't go to the hospital. People were hurt. I mean, it's just amazing, the turmoil that you go through
Man.
in dealing with that type of lifestyle.
Now, Petey, I heard now the prison system is terrible. It's totally different how it was when I mean, even when you go, they talking on a screen.
Mm.
There's no human touch, and when I used to go with my mother child, she used to sit up and we go and they eat sandwiches. We be right there. They laugh and they say, there's no more of that.
Well, you know, things have changed. The times have changed. Uh, the criminal has gotten smarter in ways to where the system has had to adjust
To them.
to deal with that.
Yeah.
And some of these little young cats is bad. You that MacGyver stuff you see on TV, there's some little cat boy go in there and rig up some stuff, open the door wide open. Go in there and his door be open. Like, well, how do you do that? Know how to rig up and do all. So from that aspect, they have to grow with the times, just like society have to grow with the times to
Man.
accommodate not only life, but then criminals too. So, it doesn't stop.
And then these young boys, 16, 17, you going from there, I have no mercy on them now. It's like, okay, you was bad enough at 16 to do it. You're going to be bad enough to serve the rest of your life in the penitentiary. It's just a sad, sad situation, and so my heart goes out. And then some of the parents, I said this before, you sit and you talk, you let your kids, they see you do everything. And oh, they all right. When they get older, no respect. And you, well, I'm a well, no, you let me see you. And so it comes back to slap you.
I tell people all the time, it's hard to control a child that's 12, 13 years old that's actually selling drugs on the street to a mother or a grandmother that's 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, even older, and they're selling drugs to them.
You truly have a testimony, so much so where if you're young, if you didn't know, you will know if you just listen. The experience of other people can help you. And that was really powerful. I mean, you broke it real talk. So I appreciate that. And those that are listening, maybe this can help you. Petey's always tried to help young people anyway. That is his passion for young people. So I thank you. Now, we've talked all about the Gambino family and uh, everything else. Now let's talk about when you turned your life around and you said, I don't want to do this. You've always been a hustler, but then you took that hustling to a businessman. What, from prison to business,
Right.
what made you say, I'm ready to do this?
It was God.
Okay, come on.
Let me tell you how.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I got out and I said, okay, let me get my crew back together.
Okay, okay.
You get out and you get complacent because you're back home.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm out. I'm gonna get busy. I'm gonna get back on my feet. And I called my little crew and said, man, come on, y'all. Bring your money. I'm finna make a run. It's on.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So had they bought their money. One of them sold their Camaro drop top to bring me his part of the money, you know what I mean? And I said, okay, I'm on my way. Here I go back cross country again. And I get there and I meet with my people. I stay the night and the next day we handle business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that following day, it's like, okay, I'm finna go on back home. I'm good.
Mhm.
And the stuff was on the table in the kitchen.
You mean what?
The
Money, dope, what?
Yeah, the drugs was on the
Okay.
table in the
Okay.
kitchen.
Mhm.
Now, my people are standing there. I'm standing there, and I go to reach for the bag.
Mhm. Man.
Something touched me,
Ooh, ooh, my God, Lord have mercy.
and it shook me to the core. And I said, and I looked at him,
Mm.
and
Mm. Mm.
he had fear in his eyes.
My God.
And he's looking at me, and he said, "What's wrong with you?" That's how discontorted my face was from the touch.
Mm.
And I'm looking at him. I'm like, "Why you touch me?"
Mm.
He said, "I ain't touch you."
Oh my.
I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "No, I didn't. What's wrong with you?" I said, "Nothing, man." I said, "Nothing. Just something wasn't right." He said, "Man, go on and go home, man. You tripping." I said, "Okay." I went and reached again. This time it touched me stronger. This time it touched me and it showed me getting arrested. On my way home, getting stopped, arrested, gone forever. Clear as a bell. And I looked at my people again, and he's looking at me like, "What the heck? What's going on with you?" And I was like, "Nothing." I said, "I can't do it. I can't do it." He said, "You can't do what?" I
That's
said,
medicine and hit you, boy.
I said, "I can't do it." I said, "Something is telling me I'm not gonna make it home." He's like, "What?"
My God.
He said, you didn't spend all of my." I said, "No, you got to give me that bread back." I said, "I can't do it. I got to take this money back. You got here you go. I can't do it." Now, if it wasn't my people that I love, I couldn't have done that. But it's my people that I love that I didn't have to worry. They gave my bread back, and I came all the way back home with all that money and gave everybody back their money. Then my partner that sold his Camaro to give me the money, to this day, he don't speak to me today because that was his favorite car. He mad. "Man, I was gonna get another one. Now I sold my car." So I come back home and I'm sitting at the house. And this whole time it kept playing back over my mind.
Were you by yourself?
Yeah, I was sitting there by myself. So I come in and maybe it's about probably about a week later, and I come in the house and the mail is through the chute on the floor, on the ground. So I pick the mail up. I go in the room, I throw it on the bed. I ain't tripping, going by my business. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm finna come up with a different hustle. I got things to do. That's dead now. I'm figure out something else. So I'm sitting there. So uh uh my people come in and she's like, "What we doing today?" I said, let's go to dinner, go chill out for a minute. Come on back home. So we went back home. We get in bed. The mail is on the bed, and I knocked it on the floor.
Mhm.
Went to sleep. Got up that morning, and I was sitting there, and I was like, "Dang, I knocked all this mail on the floor from yesterday." I said, "Let me check this mail." So I pop the mail and I'm looking at it, and then I go across this envelope from the bank, and I said, what is this?" So I opened it up, and there was a note in there from the bank. It said, "You're a valued customer.
Mm.
You and so and so have been valued customers for us, blase, blase, blase." And I said, "Oh, wow." And it said, "You are approved for a $50,000 loan with a credit card with a $14,000 cash advancement on it." God put that into play because I followed his rules up there and didn't do it. He blessed me a whole nother way that I didn't even think about it. So I took that card, that paper, and I called the bank. Because they send out that stuff all the time. Then you call, it's a catch to it.
Mhm.
I called the bank. I said, "What's going on with this? How can y'all send me this mess? Messing with me."
Mm.
"Well, no, that's not a joke. That's legit. You can come in and get that right now." I said, "I'll be right there. Don't worry about nothing. I'll be right there." I went down there, and sure enough, sure
I
enough,
know you just wanted to holler.
man, was the purple light. I said, "Boy, I can't believe this."
He'll
Now, I come back and got self situated. So I get with my family
Mhm.
and I said, listen,
Hmm.
this is what's going on. This is what's happening. I said, now, what are we going to do? I said, I'm going to give everybody 3 days to think about
Mhm.
what we need to do. Come back again in 3 days. We're going back to the black round table. We're going to sit down and we're going to chop it up and see what we're going to do.
Mhm.
I said, because this is it. If this don't work, it's back to the blade for you and me
Mhm.
and everybody involved. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So this got to work where we put this. Come back, sit down, really we can't come up with nothing. And then I said, wait a minute, hold on. If you go into people business, you always gonna have business. No matter what it is with a body,
Mhm.
something
Mhm.
you're gonna have money because you're gonna never run out of
Mhm.
business.
Mhm.
And one of my people had background in the bonding business. And I said, hey,
Mhm.
let's do that. You already know how to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I kind of got a little experience. I said, well, I tell you what, I'm finna send you to bonding school. You finna go get your stuff, and we gonna open this joint up.
Uh,
That was 22 years ago, as far as that was concerned. You know what I'm saying? More than 22 years ago. And that's how I went from there to there. And then it went into a successful bonding venture for my family. And I was able to make sure that my children and not even my grandchildren now were taken care of through that, you know, where it made I had to make it make sense.
Man, that's awesome.
Yeah, I had to make it make sense. So it added up, and it wasn't so much for me as much as it was for them. I was more concerned about them, and a lot of people, you'll lose a lot of kudos and twos and fews and whatever.
Mhm.
Oh, you're from the streets. How can you do this kind of business? How can you do? Hold up, player. I got kids to take care of. I got grandkids to take care of. And I'm not the type of father that didn't take care of his kids,
Oh no,
the ones that I could take care of.
exactly.
You see what I'm saying? I'm not him. So now you might be that type of father where you didn't care about your children
Mhm.
or didn't care what happened or what, I wasn't him. I tried to be hands on with mine the best I could,
Yeah.
the ones that I could be.
Mhm.
You know, and so I need to make sure they was okay. You know what I mean? And that's how it ended up to where it went, and it worked out fine. So I don't care about you used to be from the streets, you used to this, used to that didn't feed my kids, used to be this, used to be that.
Come on.
I have to worry about what is now.
Yeah.
They needed stuff. They needed things, so then they needed a way and a guidance, to where they understood business,
Mm.
because the biggest problem we have is a lot of these young girls and a lot of these young kids don't get an opportunity to learn good business from somebody
Mhm.
that's older when back in the gap they used to take you under their wing and show you something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was definitely a formality. They don't do that anymore. And I told my daughters, look, I don't want y'all in the alley somewhere doing something you ain't got no
Yeah.
business doing to try to pay a phone bill
Yeah.
or trying to pay a car note. So make sure y'all straight. And that's what I did. And to this day, they still good.
That's awesome. Now, what made you? Well, I know, I'm sure driving and hustling. That's all you did was driving and hustling, driving. What made you go into the truck? Do you enjoy it? Is that truly a blessing? I mean, every you post stuff, you on the highway or get ready to hit this, and you just see the glow of I'm at peace. I'm enjoying it. I ride.
Mm.
Um, do you really? And when you look back, it's like, man, I'm living. I thought I living life hustling. My brother's the same. Most of them hustlers don't have nothing. They either dead or in jail or they broke as Job's turkey.
Mm-hmm.
But for you, you're on the highway and doing things and just how does it feel to be right?
Well, it's comforting. There's a comfort level in that
Mm-hmm.
that you can't pay for. It's valuable. I mean, it's just no price on that, and it takes care of itself and you. and then it takes care of you and your family with it. When you come to the realization that you're gonna be doing this and it's good for you.
Mhm.
Well, my thing was this: if it's somewhere about getting some money, I'm gonna be in it. I'm
Mhm.
gonna be in the line.
Uh,
Next,
uh-huh.
okay, I'm gonna figure it out. So to me, the CDL part of it was okay. The CDL part of it was, hey, this is bread, and this is the kind of money I like.
Okay.
So this is what I'm finna get into, as well, for my family and me. So just like I sold into the family
Mhm.
to get going, they turned around and sold into me into the trucking.
Man.
And so now went on from there, and for the most part, it's been wonderful. You know what I mean? Just them running their thing and
Mhm.
me doing my thing. You're gonna go up and down,
Exactly.
being in business, that's why it's called business.
Yeah.
Good days, bad days,
Yeah.
that's business.
Yeah.
So, but being cross country and being in different places, I enjoyed the fact that you could be in New York or Chicago having breakfast with a person with a Chicago accent,
Yeah.
and then by that night when you shut down for dinner, you be in New Orleans with somebody with a New Orleans accent. It's the weirdest thing because you go from one genre to another one within a day's time, and they're talking totally different with different food, different
Yeah.
cuisine,
Yeah.
different people, different stuff. And the biggest part about traveling is the unknown. People are scared to travel because they don't know where they're going. They don't know what's ahead of them. They don't know like where the rest areas is, where the gas stations are, where the shops are, where the stores are.
Mhm.
Once you get to traveling across the United States, all of that becomes one. And
Mm.
to me, driving from here to Dallas is like driving from Denver to Aurora for me.
Oh.
It's like that. It's that simple.
Yeah.
And once you know everything along the way, you're not scared. Then it becomes comfortable.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I know 20 miles up here, there's a tire shop if I blow a tire. I know 100 miles up here,
Yeah.
there's a stop I like to stop and get them cinnamon rolls over here.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
So
Right.
like that, it makes a difference. And that's where, becomes comfortable. Then you can really just start vibing and getting your money.
Well, we have to get ready to wind down, but and before I close out, is there something that you want to tell to young people that are thinking that they want to be the hustler from a man of much experience? Where you have been, what would you like to leave for the young people, young men? Women have different ones, but for young men that think, I want to be a OG gangster, do
Mm,
you really?
mm.
Because it's totally different than it was back then.
Right. Um, my thing is, I look forward to the day when I'll be able to step into these schools and touch these young souls and let them know the difference in life, as they want to know it. And if you think for 1 minute that the OG thing, the hustling thing, and all that is where you want to go, I mean, hey, people do what they want to do.
Exactly.
But I would recommend you doing something else different.
Mm-hmm.
You can make more money if you go to college, get a good education behind you, get a good, trade behind you, something like that. Our people are more um hands on,
Mm-hmm.
about things. And that's, like I said, is very important for the older people to teach these younger people hands on, because, okay, we ain't that book smart or whatever about something supposedly, because, excuse me, most of the black people in the world and made all the great achievements in the world that has made the world a better place. So I didn't know where they get that. We ain't supposed to be just as smart, but
Mhm.
excuse me, we are. And they can get a good trade behind them and move mountains, and do things and make way more money than trying to do anything in those streets. So I wouldn't recommend you young guys getting out there trying this stuff. If you're approached on that level, speak to your parents about that situation. Don't try and get caught up in that.
Mhm.
If you're being peer pressured about that with your friends, disassociate yourself with it.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Blame it on your parents. Hey, my mom, dad said I can't be around you no more.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
and then if you want any kind of success in this life, you have to carry yourself with a discipline, with respect for your elders and yourself. That's something that you're gonna have to live with and keep in your heart. That so your karma is good on God's side, where He gonna look out for you to keep you moving. Don't keep tearing up your karma so it keeps coming back bad. Keep building your good karma so it comes back good. Respect everybody, do what you have to do, stay out the way. And I know it's gonna be hard sometimes because that's just life. But being real men and women out here young, you want to do it correctly. That's the best way to do it. And if I ever get the opportunity to get to these schools, that's what I'm gonna bring to them. I'm gonna bring my whole squad. And I'm gonna bring it to them in the raw and let them know exactly. There's things we ain't touched here
No, I can
that they
imagine.
need to
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Well, you heard it from my guest, awesome speaker. I mean, he truly is an experienced man dealing with the streets. There's so many. Three of my brothers, three of us was good, and the mother was bad in and out of penitentiary, everything else. And I have to say this one thing about our mothers back then, they weren't scared of us. They weren't scared. My mother said, I brought you in, I'll take you out. They were not. I don't care how big you were. It was on and cracking if you disrespected them.
Yeah.
So I hope it goes back where children can respect their mothers and fathers. Is we're in a time now that so many people are weakened by the destruction and the dangerous and the no respect. But with God, we can all make it. So, Petey, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate you for being on my show
Thank you
with
for having me.
Real Talk with Lequita Taylor.
I knew it was coming.
You just didn't know when I caught you off guard, did I? That's the best place.
Yeah.
Well, you all, we love you. Thank
Yes.
you again. Coming up is the holiday where we always kind of edit. But I do want to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone, and
Happy New Year.
stay encouraged.
Bless.
And look to God, who He will never leave us nor forsake us. So again, like, subscribe, share. We get ready to do some more things, getting ready.
Yeah.
But again, I love you all, and you all be blessed. And thank you for joining me. Real Talk with Laquita Taylor now. Good night.
All right.